Hello, I'm Paul Beresford-Hill, the Sovereign Order of Malta's Ambassador to the United Nations. Today, there are more people, institutions and structures put in place to lift people out of poverty around the world. Nearly 1.2 billion people have seen their livelihoods improve because of concerted efforts to reduce poverty over the last 30 years. However, billions still live in dire straits, with women, children, and the elderly being disproportionately affected. And in light of the COVID pandemic, the predictions for the next decade foresee a world plagued by greater challenges and growing instability. I would now like to welcome remarks from the permanent observer of the Holy See and the permanent representatives of Ireland and Lithuania to the United Nations.
Stretch forth your hands to the poor. These words by C.S.R are echoed by Pope Francis in the theme chosen for the World Day of the Poor, which will take place this Sunday, November 15. Pope Francis established this commemoration in 2017 to spur Christian communities to imitate Jesus' preferential love for the poor and to encourage people of all faiths and no faith to reject the culture of waste and embrace one of solidarity, fraternity, and concrete care, stretching forth their hands to those in need. All of us have seen, at least in photographs, Michelangelo's famous creation of Adam on the vault of the Sistine Chapel. God stretches forth his hands to impart to Adam the gift of life. We imitate the life-giving, loving generosity of God every time we stretch our hands toward those in need, who are created in the image of God and in the image of Adam and Eve. Stretching forth our hands begins not with our arms, but with our eyes and our heart. We must first look around and see many people who are hurting. Then our hearts must be moved with compassion for those who are suffering. In his recent encyclical, Fratelli Tutti, Pope Francis challenged Christians and all people of goodwill to relate to those in need like the Good Samaritan in Jesus' famous parable, to cross the road and draw near, to allow ourselves to be inconvenienced and to take personal responsibility for helping them get back on their feet. Many, Pope Francis says, walk by the other side of the road, not noticing others' pain, not being moved enough to act. Pope Francis is calling us all, rather, to behave as brothers and sisters, literally, fratelli tutti. Not to keep our hands in our pockets, not to wash our hands of the situation of others, but to extend both hands to pick others up. During this pandemic, when normal human interaction like handshakes have been prudently restricted, we have become even more grateful for the outstretched hands of doctors, nurses, pharmacists, clergy, volunteers, and neighbors. Pope Francis is summoning all of us to imitate that concern, courage, and generosity. He's asking us to lift up our hands in prayer, and is calling us to join our hands to work together. Today's event is to help us to do just that. Thank you for your desire to join this worldwide mobilization of Good Samaritans, and may God bless you all.
Thank you, Your Excellency. Speaking in the General Assembly in 2018, the President of Ireland, Michael D. Higgins, called it an affront to humanity that in these first decades of the 21st century, at a time when we have the capacity to abolish all forms of human poverty, We share a planet with hundreds of millions who are, even as we speak here today, deprived of their most fundamental rights, deprived of a dignified existence. Sadly, since he spoke those words, things have only gotten worse. The 2030 Agenda recognizes that eradicating poverty in all its forms and dimensions is the greatest global challenge and indispensable requirement for sustainable development. Yet now, in the midst of a global pandemic, the share of the world's population living in extreme poverty is forecast to increase almost 9%, representing an additional 71 million people. As we mark World Day of the Poor, we must promise not to become inured to the poverty and suffering which exists all around us. We must be outraged, and we must be determined. Determined to deliver on the transformative promise of the SDGs. Determined to build back better, but also to build back fairer. Thank you.
Dear Excellencies, dear panelists, colleagues and friends, poverty is undoubtedly one of the biggest global sores. No one in the world is immune to it. Poverty is able to hurt all and each of us, regardless of continent, level of country's development, family income, individual skills, and personal abilities. There is no country on the world map where the problem of poverty is not relevant. Furthermore, the COVID-19 pandemic pushed back millions of people worldwide to extreme poverty. The most vulnerable groups, such as women, children, disabled persons, suffer most of all. Today, as never before, we need to join our efforts and actions to combat poverty. Every effort, be it from the United Nations or any other international organization, state, government or business, local community or the church, family or individual, matters and counts. Lithuania, my country, also acts nationally, regionally and globally in striving to contribute to this common aim. Eradication of poverty is not only a national concern, but also part of our foreign development policy. We believe that zero poverty should become an aspiration of every just and socially sensitive government. We need long-term strategies which would include all global actors and all stakeholders within our societies and which would be united by common global political will. In this regard, I would like to praise the Pope Francis' initiative to commemorate the World Day of the Poor and his appeal to stretch forth our hands to poor. It goes along with Agenda 2030 and especially its Sustainable Development Goal number 1, which calls for no poverty. We should jointly enter the pivotal decade for meeting this global challenge. Therefore, I wish a good discussion today on how we could work together. What shall each of us do in order to reach every country, every community, and every person in need? Thank you.
On this World Day of the Poor, the Order of Malta's mission to the UN, along with our partners at America Media, the missions of the Holy See, Ireland and Lithuania to the United Nations, Catholic Charities USA, Fordham University's IPED program, and CAP USA, call on all peoples to reflect on how they can be in solidarity with the poor. Whether it's through volunteering, political and social advocacy, supporting causes that relieve poverty, or by engaging in the non-profit and civic spheres, we all have a part to play in serving the neediest of our brothers and sisters, those who can never be forgotten. To provide further insights on how we can best meet these challenges, I now invite Father Matt Malone, the President and Editor-in-Chief of America Media, to introduce today's panel discussion.
Thank you, Ambassador Beresford-Hill, and our thanks to the Order of Malta's mission to the United Nations for partnering with America Media on today's event. in commemoration of the 2020 World Day of the Poor. In his 2020 letter for the World Day of the Poor, Pope Francis recalls the final words of the Book of Sirach. In everything you do, remember your end. Our end here today is to remember and to be with the poor amongst us. We must avoid, as Pope Francis notes, a globalization of indifference, and we must take a hard look at the root causes of poverty and bear the responsibility each of us has to work to provide opportunities and support for our brothers and sisters. Before we begin, I would like to note one great resource provided by our partners at Fordham University's graduate program in International Political Economy and Development. The program produces the Pope Francis Global Poverty Index each year, and it offers some detailed and thoughtful analysis on the state of poverty throughout the world. It can be found, along with our other resources, at americamagazine.org/Day of the Poor 2020. To begin to address the questions posed by the challenge of Pope Francis, we are very glad to welcome our panel today. Our first panelist is Nick Kristof, an op-ed columnist for the New York Times, who has written extensively on global poverty, but with his recent book, Tightrope, he has brought the story closer to home, focusing on his own personal experiences with poverty in the United States. Our next guest is Sister Donna Markham, who serves as the president and CEO of Catholic Charities USA. In her position at Catholic Charities USA, Sister Donna oversees works that provide help and hope to over 9 million Americans every year. And last but not least is Maria-Francesca Spatolisano, Assistant Secretary General for Policy Coordination and Interagency Affairs at the United Nations. Ms. Spatolisano is the former EU ambassador to the OECD and UNESCO, Monaco, and Andorra, and has worked extensively in matters of economics and trade. So thank you all very much for being with us. Sizable gains have been made in combating poverty over the last several decades. Billions of people have seen improvements in their economic and social conditions. According to the United Nations, nearly 10% of the world's population lives on less than $1.90 per day, but that is down from 36% in 1990. But these successes are perhaps facing their greatest challenge in the time of COVID-19. And so I would like to start with Ms. Spatolisano. How has COVID set back the international anti-poverty agenda?
So thank you so much for organizing this event and for having me with this distinguished panel. And let me as well, to begin with, commend Pope Francis for establishing the World Day of the Poor, which gathers us today around this very important theme. I'll do my best to present the UN action to fight against poverty. First thing I would like to underscore is that eradicating poverty is the central objective of the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development, which the world leaders have adopted in 2015, and they have all committed to a set of goals, the first one of which is indeed eradicating poverty. And this day, therefore, represents a genuine opportunity to accelerate global action. We only have a 10 years span of time to achieve these objectives according to this document, the Agenda 2030, who was subscribed by the world leaders. So it's really difficult and we have little time. But as you know, even before the COVID pandemic, this was a tough, tall order. No country has been spared by the pandemic. So it is a real challenge in less developed as well as in other countries, because all have suffered on the health side, the population has suffered, but also there is a spillover in the economic, in the socio-economic sphere. So this is a direct and indirect impact of the pandemic on a lot of policies which were meant to accelerate the fight against poverty. And inequality, unfortunately, also has been on the rise as job losses and inadequate, I should say, social protection systems were heavily affected. Let me give you a few figures on this. As you said, there were remarkable progress in poverty reduction since the 90s, but this progress had slowed down already in more recent years. Globally, extreme poverty dropped by an average of about 1 percentage point per year from 1990 to 2015. However, since then, the rate of decline diminished, and in fact, it halved in the last 5 years, let's say. So the world, as I said, was not on track to achieve the goal of eradicating poverty already before the pandemic. And with the pandemic, poverty is expected to rise everywhere in the world for the first time since the 90s. And we estimate that the pandemic will globally push an additional 88 million people, some say even more, 115 million people, into extreme poverty in 2020. So the total would rise to as many as 150 million by 2021. And there is a logic, unfortunately, into this. Most of them are in the informal sector, who has, by definition, no protection, no social protection, no networks to support these people. Another way to look at it is the age groups. Young people aged 15 to 24 account for 20% of the global population in extreme poverty, and live on an income below $1.90 per day. But many older persons also are at heavy risk, of course, of being left behind and experience social exclusion. Women and female-headed households are another group at heavy risk, affected heavily by the pandemic. And so are people with disabilities, of course, as they may have even more limited access to employment and other social programs. So unfortunately, the picture is really not a good one, and we certainly need to act. And I guess this panel will discuss how to face this terrible situation in front of us.
Well, thank you very much, Francesca, for that very interesting and enlightening overview of the situation, especially in the last 30 or 40 years. Sister Donna, these events that Francesca was just talking about have been followed closely by governments, by people of goodwill across the globe, but especially by the occupant of the chair of St. Peter, our own Pope Francis. And the Pope has repeatedly mentioned the issue of global poverty and of taking an approach to global poverty that is centered on the common good. That's a phrase that comes up a lot in his statements about this. What does he mean by that? What is the common good, and how is that an organizing principle for our response to poverty?
Well, yeah, a little bit truth in advertising. I'm not a theologian and I'm not an economist, so I'm going to be speaking as a clinical psychologist who's been very involved on the ground with a lot of people who are suffering horribly. So when I respond to that, Father Malone, it's from the perspective of a practitioner. So that being said, most of my life has been spent with the severely and persistently mentally ill. And that just makes up one bundle of people who are falling into horrible straits these days, especially in relationship to the pandemic. We are dealing with about 13 million people every year who are experiencing very fragile lives on the margins of society. And those are, I'm talking about people who don't have food, who don't have a place to live, who have lost their jobs, and are becoming severely depressed, sometimes suicidal in the situation. Our Black and Brown communities are suffering disproportionately in this situation, and the failure of our social safety net. Now, with regard to Pope Francis's wonderful focus on the common good and his emphasis on the importance of integral human development, that has spoken very loudly to all of us in the ministry of Catholic Charities these days. What it means for us as Catholic Charities is that we work to help every human being address or achieve what we would say as access to the social determinants of health and well-being. And those determinants of health and well-being include the right to economic stability, a job, to adequate health care, to education, to housing, to something to eat, and to be able to live in a safe community. We know that in the past month, our data have shown us that 8 million more Americans have fallen below the poverty line. So the situation is really dire. That puts us in Catholic Charities all the more focused on trying to provide jobs training, small business development, healthcare, mental health care particularly, housing assistance, food security, and all of those things that make for what we would call the social determinants of health and well-being, which make it possible for a human being to participate in society with dignity. Now, for Catholic Charities, providing assistance is just the first part of what we need to do. And of course, right now, this is an emergency situation. So much of our effort is directed toward providing assistance. But the second obligation that we have is to engage in vigorous advocacy with all levels of our government to bring about policy revisions that affect the lives of vulnerable people. In other words, to really talk about policies that make the common good, or the good that we hold in common, a possibility for people. So we advocate for tax reform, healthcare, low-income housing opportunities, criminal justice reform, racial equity, among a lot of issues. And the third obligation that we assume as Catholic Charities is to convene other people of goodwill to join us in efforts directed toward the promotion of the good that we hold in common. So we talk about serving, advocating, and convening. Clearly, that's not just the responsibility of Catholic Charities. It's the work of all of us who call ourselves the people of God, and certainly for those of us that call ourselves Catholic. But we also have to engage in public-private partnerships with our government, because the charitable sector can't do this alone. None of us, I believe, is off the hook when it comes to working for justice, equity, and care for every human being, especially today for those that are very, very much hanging on to a thread of sustenance. So that's where I go with it, from the ground.
Sure. And Nick Kristof, as Sister Donna said, none of us is off the hook in dealing with in having to confront these issues, but some people have lived these realities in a way that a lot of us have not. And you speak to this in your recent book, Tightrope. You have a unique perspective on this stuff, because you, not only from your perch at a national newspaper, but you've actually lived it.
Yeah, and we wrote Tightrope before the pandemic, but even before then, there were pandemics of despair that were causing enormous mortality and morbidity across the United States, and in many other countries as well. So we tell the story in part through the prism of the kids who were on my old school bus in rural Oregon, a small town of about 1,000 people on a good day. And a quarter of those kids who were on that bus with me are now gone from drugs, alcohol, and suicide, what are called deaths of despair. Even before the pandemic, US life expectancy had fallen for 3 years in a row for the first time in a century, actually since the 1918 flu pandemic. And the kind of factors that caused this mortality and morbidity in working class communities across the US have now been exacerbated by COVID-19. They were issues like loss of meaningful jobs. Well, 11 million people lost their jobs because of the pandemic. It's lack of access to healthcare. Well, more than 1 million additional people lost their jobs across the US, in part because the US has this strange system where health insurance is tied to your job. And something that is harder to nail down, perhaps, but is social isolation and loneliness. There has been a pandemic of loneliness across the industrialized world that researchers increasingly associate with mortality. And there's been research that this kind of social isolation is equivalent to smoking almost a pack of cigarettes a day, that it has a higher death toll than obesity does in the United States. And I saw that in my community, that people were disconnected from the social fabric, they self-medicated, and they died early. And what has social distancing in a pandemic done? Of course, by necessity, it has magnified that loneliness. The CDC says that did a study in June that said that 13% of Americans had either begun a dependency problem or had increased their dependency use, alcohol or drugs. And so, as in the developing world abroad, we tend to focus on the immediate contagion of the virus, but in fact, the ripple effects of malnutrition, of maternal mortality, of vitamin A deficiency, all these other, on polio, all those factors are particularly striking. So too in the United States, obviously mortality is mostly coming from the virus itself, but there is a huge pandemic of despair and unemployment and kind of mental health crisis that is following along, exacerbating long-term problems we had.
And Francesca, in light of I'm sure we're seeing a lot of what Nick Kristof and Sister Donna are talking about across the world. Certainly in the Western world, where we see it reported on television. Are we at a kind of tipping point? Has the COVID pandemic woken up our policymakers and political leadership and pointed out places that we need to act that perhaps they didn't feel the impetus to act for previously?
Let's say the UN is an organization which has now reached the age of 75 years old. And of course, it's a good moment to ask what has been its value added and what should it do in the next 75 or more years. And certainly this pandemic, as you said, has put everyone in front of the essential questions. And I think for the UN, we have tried to give a comprehensive response. There is a recently published report of the Secretary General to address indeed the various dimensions of the pandemic, which is called Comprehensive Response to COVID-19, and has three main guidelines. One is first saving life. In the immediate, that's the first thing you have to do, deal with the health crisis. But then we have to think about societies and protecting the social fabric and ultimately recover better. Recovering better, I think, is what we can do and we should do and put our strength and abilities to do, because we don't want to go back and do things as before. This is the message. We should use this terrible moment to build better societies. And to do so, as Sister Donna was saying, we need to have a different approach to addressing the use of public resources. We have to address inequalities. We have to provide everybody with their basic needs, and these include health and education and food and shelter and so on and so forth. So I think we have, as UN, tried and to seize this opportunity to think how to do things better. I just add an information. The General Assembly will convene a special session early in December, indeed, to discuss how to do this. And it's a good opportunity to bring your ideas, everybody's ideas, to the front.
Sister Donna and Nick Kristof, similar question. Is this a tipping point in the U.S.? Have we come to a place where we see these problems in a new way, or they've been revealed in a new way? Do you feel like this moment might be different vis-a-vis our national commitment to ending these problems and really vigorously pursuing solutions?
Well, let me start with that. I wish I could say that it was really going to change the public opinion on how we're dealing with people who are living on the margins. I'm not sure. I'm really not sure, because I think that what we've seen, at least in this country, has been a disregard for our brothers and sisters, and the way we've tried to deal with the pandemic has been shameful. And so I don't know. I think on a more positive note, I would speak about what's happening with Caritas Internationalis, which is the umbrella organization of all the Catholic Charities organizations across the world. And Caritas Internationalis has a permanent seat at the UN. And when we get together as the leaders of our various country Caritas organizations, that group becomes a very strong avenue for solidarity and trying to draw attention to and address these issues as Catholics, and our moral obligation to attend to the needs of all of our brothers and sisters, especially the least of them. So I have more hope there. I have to say, I don't know what's happening with the American people. I feel very discouraged. And maybe Nick has a more hopeful response than I do.
Well, first, let me say, Sister Donna, that, thank you for your work and that of your colleagues in making this a better country and a better world. And that's one thing that gives me a ray of hope. I am, I think, just a little bit more optimistic than you domestically, but I'm not optimistic internationally. So domestically, I think that, many of these problems that we talk about are 50 years in the making. They aren't President Trump is more a symptom of the problem than a creator of these. And I think they, in many ways, are rooted in racism, reluctance to invest in human capital and education and healthcare of the marginalized because they were people of color. And I also, though, think that history does work in cycles, as Arthur Schlesinger wrote, and that it may be that this cycle has been changing. And you saw even red states have been busy expanding Medicaid. You saw Texas lead the way in reducing mass incarceration. You saw Kansas, again, before the pandemic, cut its budget so much that schools were hurting. And then Kansas Republicans led the way and said, tax us more so that we can invest in education. And then the pandemic on top of that, I think, made clear many of our country's failures and the fact that we don't have universal health coverage becomes, I think, more obvious to everyone at a time of infectious disease than in a time of chronic disease. Likewise, the lack of universal paid sick leave. So, I sometimes wonder if we don't have a chance to address some of these long-term inequities. I think the fact that there was this interest in African American issues and Black Lives Matter this year, again, offers some indication that that many Americans are a little more willing to think beyond race, think of the marginalized and how to address these issues. So I'm not sure I would bet that this will happen, but I think there's a fighting chance. On the international side, though, I'm a little discouraged. I think the U.S. and other countries are looking inward. There has been very little discussion about how badly the pandemic has affected poor countries around the world. The issue has been virtually invisible. We haven't seen leaders addressing it. There's been, one reason why the last 20 years have been successful is that there really was a broad consensus across political lines, across faith lines. Evangelical Christians were leaders in getting PEPFAR passed to deal with AIDS around the world. And you had bleeding heart conservatives and bleeding heart liberals working together to address these issues. And I think that I fear that period may be remembered as an unusual one, and that it may be difficult to revive that kind of consensus and compassion for people of other skin colors and other passport colors after this is over. That's my big fear, that instead of sustaining this kind of international progress, this period of really concerted international effort may be a briefer period. I hope I'm wrong on that.
Sister Donna, what are the, if we're able to seize this momentum and craft a better set of public policies, what are those public policies that work best, that are most effective at reducing poverty? And also, what's the role of the private sector in all of that?
Yeah, we are involved in a joint advocacy with a lot of the charitable sector in the country to really take a look at how do we make it possible for people who are living in poverty to have access to some of the what I talked about earlier about access to the social determinants of health. So our advocacy has to be focused on the safety net, that's the shorthand for that. Or as we could say in terms of our church, integral human development. But we have to focus on those issues. We can't do it alone. And I think that the joint efforts that we make from the charitable sector is really the way we have to move. So it's calling us to a lot of collaboration. I think one of the critical issues that will really be the proof of the pudding for us is, and this goes to something Nick just said, what are we going to do about equitable distribution of the vaccine if and when it becomes available? Is that going to just be with the first world countries like the United States, the Western developed countries, and we just keep it all to ourselves and we don't care about what's happening in India or in Brazil or in Bangladesh? Or are we, what are we going to do with that? And I think those kinds of questions really call us to some serious conversations, which we are engaged in on the Hill, to really say, this can't just be for the United States. We may develop it. I don't know whether we will or not. But if we do, the temptation will be, okay, get all those Americans vaccinated and to heck with the rest of the world. And what are we saying to our brothers and sisters across the world in that? That's going to be a real moral test for us, I believe, as this unfolds. So, my 2 cents.
And Nick Kristof, as you point out in your book, it's we do need a new set of public policies, and we need a concerted public effort here. The private sector has a role, but there's also a spiritual dimension to this problem, isn't there? In the in the broadest sense of the term, what you were describing in terms of social isolation, of people's sense of estrangement from the community, those are profound existential crises, aren't they?
Yeah, absolutely. But I'd also note that one difference from 25 years ago is that now we do have a good sense of what works. We have policy tools, both vis-a-vis domestic poverty and international poverty, partly because there have been randomized controlled trials, partly because there have been rigorous economic studies. And so, we know that, if you think about child allowances, so Canada, Britain, most of Europe, Australia have introduced child allowances, and you can use child allowances roughly to reduce child poverty in half. One thing that Tony Blair did that nobody gives him credit for is he reduced child poverty in half in 5 years in Britain. And, that's an extraordinary achievement. We have early childhood education as well. The low-hanging fruit to try to address some of these inequities in the U.S. The fact that we can't even deal with lead poisoning, that 500,000 American kids still have elevated lead each year, should be a scandal. And so what strikes me is that we now have a toolbox to address these kinds of issues. And we have the resources. The U.S. is arguably the richest country in the history of the world. Of course, we have the resources. What we lack is the political will. And that's what I think it is possible that COVID will help bring about. I think that also one impediment has been the narrative that we've had, a narrative that government can't do anything right, a narrative that it's all about personal responsibility and about bad choices. And, I look at my own community, the kids on my bus who are dead, yes, they made bad choices, but society made a lot of pretty bad choices too. We as taxpayers, we paid to incarcerate my friends, not to educate them, not to give them job training. And in 3 U.S. counties, the life expectancy at birth is shorter than the life expectancy in either Cambodia or Bangladesh. That's not because those infants are making bad choices. It's because we as a country are making bad choices about healthcare, social services. And so that narrative, I think that narrative is one of the reasons we wrote Tightrope, and one of the things that I'm most passionate about having all of us try to address.
And I want to make sure that we give the last word to the global perspective. So, Francesca, I want to bring you back into the conversation. In light of the fact that, as Sister Donna and Nick Kristof have said, we know what the solutions are for many of these problems. What's lacking is the political will. At a global level, from your point of view at the United Nations, what stands in the way of the global community coming together, or at a minimum, the West, to address these challenges?
Well, I couldn't agree more with what has been said. Political will is very important, because political will is what creates consensus at the global level, and through that consensus, then we can make commitments and implement them. Certainly, every real action has to be a local action on the ground to reach out to the people in need. But the political will at the global level is what determines the trends. And as it was said, that is unfortunately not as present nowadays as it was even in 2015 when those Sustainable Development Goals were adopted. So we have to hang on this framework, this Agenda 2030 as a framework, because it's been subscribed and still applies, and we have to implement it so that it can be, of use to everybody. But on top of that, of course, there are a number of other elements we can use to bring action, and that is, I would say, the pressure from civil society. It's very important. The UN do partner with civil society organizations a lot in order to achieve the objectives that governments sometimes alone cannot or are not so motivated to achieve. So it's important to have all the actors in the room, and they have them acting together to to reach those objectives. Certainly, private sector has a lot to contribute, and when I say a lot, I don't mean only the money. Money is important. We need money. In fact, all our actions are underfunded, so we need the money. But that is not the only thing. Big companies can do more, can implement the, say, climate change objective or equality objectives in their own action, in their own global value chain, in their own system of job and decent jobs, and so on and so forth. So there are many ways in which private actors, civil society, big companies can contribute to the action of governments and the global goods. I also would like to add on this that the idea that a vaccine, of course, should not be kept for only a few, but should be considered a common good, is exactly what the Secretary General has also advocated for, and we have created a system by which many countries have subscribed, pulling together resources and research ability. Unfortunately, not yet the United States, as you said, but the system is there, and we hope it will attract all the countries in the world. Thank you.
Well, Francesca Spatolisano of the United Nations, thank you. And thank you, Sister Donna Markham of Catholic Charities and Nick Kristof of the New York Times for being with us today on this World Day of the Poor. America Magazine is proud to be able to bring you this conversation for the World Day of the Poor in partnership with the Sovereign Order of Malta's mission to the United Nations, as well as with the support of our many sponsors.
Thank you, Father Malone, and to all of our panelists and our speakers today. It is now my pleasure to invite His Excellency Dominique, Prince de la Rochefoucauld Montbel, Grand Hospitaller of the Sovereign Order of Malta, to offer a special reflection on this World Day of the Poor. Your Excellency.
Your Eminence, Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, my appeal for the fourth World Day of the Poor can only enhance the message sent by His Holiness Pope Francis. Stretch forth your hand to the poor. And our duty as members, volunteers and staff of the Sovereign Order of Malta is to convert this message into action as a gesture of faith. As St. Matthew reminds us by a timeless truth, whatever you did for one of these least of my brothers and sisters of mine, you did it for me. Especially in these days, while the world is hit by a pandemic, you must reach out to the periphery where new poverty, social distress, and isolation are knocking on our doors. Faith leaders, politicians, civil society have the responsibility to take into account these needs wherever they appear in order to assure equal rights and trust in local and international institutions as well as global coexistence for the well-being of us all. Mutual trust and human communion are keys to success. I heartily ask you to be the loudspeaker of this message. Stretch out forth your hand to the poor. Thank you.
Thank you, Your Excellency. The Order of Malta is proud to live out the message of service to the poor and those in need, all the more so under your leadership. Now, as we conclude today's events, I would like to invite His Eminence, Joseph Cardinal Tobin, Archbishop of Newark, to offer a benediction.
As we close this commemoration of the fourth World Day of the Poor, let us pray. Creator God, we praise you for your light which shines in the shadows of our world, a light that no darkness can ever overcome. We thank you for reaching out with mighty hand and outstretched arm to rescue creation from chaos and restore friendship between you and all peoples. Please grant us eyes to see the poor for who they truly are. Help us to look into their eyes and recognize their dreams and aspirations, as well as their suffering and need. May we stretch out our arms in solidarity to the poor, so that they may welcome us to our place at your table in the heavenly kingdom. You who live and reign forever and ever. Amen.
Thank you, Your Eminence, and thanks to all of you who have joined us for this event commemorating the 2020 World Day of the Poor. I'm grateful to American media and all of our partners for helping to produce this event. For more information and resources on this World Day of the Poor, please visit americamagazine.org/Day of the Poor 2020. And may we take Pope Francis's call to heart and stretch out our hands and give our hearts to the poor. Thank you, and God bless.